President John F. Kennedy supported progress in the space program during his tenure because he believed that the Soviet Union had surpassed the United States in terms of technology. Additionally, he believed that the Soviets enjoyed the backing of economically underdeveloped nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In 1961, Kennedy turned his attention to foreign affairs and implemented a policy known as flexible response. This policy focused on using traditional weapons such as jets, tanks, missiles, and guns, instead of nuclear weapons during a war. Kennedy raised defense spending to develop additional traditional weapons, aiming to decrease the likelihood of nuclear conflict. Simultaneously, a prolonged conflict in Vietnam had been occurring for more than a decade. Vietnam was split into two parts, with a communist government in the north and a democratically elected government in the south. Kennedy aimed to halt the expansion of communism in Southeast Asia, driven by the domino theory. This theory proposed that if one country in the region became communist, it could cause other countries to also become communist in a domino effect. Following Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency and carried forward Kennedy's policies. Similar to Kennedy, Johnson was resolute in his efforts to control communism in Vietnam and subsequently deployed American troops to participate in the conflict. President Kennedy encountered a predicament with a neighboring communist regime in Cuba, which was under the leadership of Fidel Castro. In 1959, Castro gained control of Cuba and declared himself a communist leader. He formed connections with the Soviet Union. At first, the United States recognized the government of Cuba. However, tensions increased when Castro took control of American and British oil refineries. Furthermore, he divided large farms and transferred them to communal groups of peasants. Because American sugar companies controlled these farms, the United States reacted by implementing trade barriers on Cuban sugar. Castro received assistance from the Soviet Union and implemented stringent political measures to carry out his reforms. A large number of Cubans disagreed with his government and fled to the United States for safety. American leaders were worried about having a communist government so near their borders. In response, Kennedy authorized a plan to oust Castro from his position of power. The plan consisted of Cuban exiles trying to invade Cuba and remove Castro from power, while the US government would offer air support to the exiles. Regrettably, the invasion, referred to as the Bay of Pigs, did not achieve its objectives. Numerous exiles were apprehended, and the mission's lack of success resulted in considerable humiliation for the Kennedy administration.
1 year later, another significant conflict arose between the United States and Cuba. American surveillance aircraft detected Soviet construction of nuclear missile bases in Cuba. Certain bases already had missiles prepared for launch, which had the potential to target the United States. President Kennedy demanded that the Soviets remove the missiles from Cuba in response. In October 1962, he used U.S. Navy ships to encircle Cuba, stopping Soviet ships from reaching the island. The situation became very tense, and there was a genuine concern that war could occur. After a period of intense negotiations, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev eventually agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. The occurrence was later referred to as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had a significant negative impact on Khrushchev's standing both within the Soviet Union and globally. President Kennedy also received criticism. Certain Americans thought that he had been excessively assertive and had taken the chance of initiating a nuclear conflict. However, certain critics believed that he should have pursued a more assertive approach by invading Cuba and ousting Castro from his position of power. The crisis led to difficult choices and triggered different viewpoints among the American populace. In 1961, President Kennedy encountered a major problem in Berlin, as the city was still divided. The communists controlled East Berlin, while Great Britain, France, and the United States governed West Berlin. By that time, nearly 3 million East Germans had already moved to West Berlin because they found living in the Free West to be very attractive. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev reacted to this situation by threatening to block all air and land routes into West Berlin. He did this by signing a treaty with East Germany. President Kennedy's warning caused Khrushchev to alter his plan. Instead, he constructed the Berlin Wall, a substantial concrete barrier that spanned the border separating East and West Berlin. The wall stopped more East Germans from escaping to the West and became a symbol of communist oppression, making tensions worse during the Cold War. Although they had disagreements, Kennedy and Khrushchev made efforts to find shared understanding. They established a hotline between their countries, which was a dedicated telephone connection enabling direct communication in times of crisis. They also agreed to the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere. As the 1960s went on, people became more worried about the possibility of nuclear accidents. Nuclear weapons were also tested by other countries like the United Kingdom, France, and China. Concerns have arisen regarding the proliferation of nuclear weapons to developing countries. To address these concerns, representatives from more than 60 countries signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
The purpose of this treaty was to restrict the spread of nuclear weapons. Nations with nuclear capabilities have agreed not to sell or transfer nuclear weapons to other countries, while nations without nuclear capabilities have promised not to obtain such weapons themselves. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union achieved the successful launch of the first man-made satellite into space. The United States also took similar actions soon after. In 1961, the Soviets accomplished another significant feat by successfully launching a human into orbit around the Earth. President Kennedy saw this as a challenge and made a confident promise that the country would send a person to the moon before the 1960s came to a close. In order to keep this promise, the United States made a series of small advancements in space exploration. Initially, they achieved the successful launch of astronaut Alan Shepard into space. Subsequently, NASA constructed dedicated facilities to aid their space missions. On July 20, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong achieved a historic milestone as he became the first person to step foot on the moon. The United States achieved something remarkable, surpassing the Soviet Union in the space race and showing its abilities in space exploration.